All right. Father, once again, we come before you and we thank you. We pray for revelation from your word. And Lord, Lord God, we invite you to speak through Brian. And that the message that you have for us this morning would be understood. And I pray that our hearts would be open in Jesus' name. Amen.
Don't know what your weeks look like, but I would like you to take a look at this past week, and if you could just kind of mentally scroll through some of the snapshots from your week, and I'd like you to look for some things in your photo roll. And I actually put up some, I don't know if this is going to work for me. There it is. I put up some frames for you. And I gave you the captions, actually, for your pictures. As you think through your photo roll, can you identify a snapshot in your mind of something that is beyond repair? And maybe even someone beyond repair. On your scavenger hunt, can you find a picture of something missing? Maybe this is a selfie. I don't know. Can you find a picture of something that needs mending? And maybe the picture is not of you, but maybe it's a picture of something in your community. We've been, Frank, a couple of weeks ago, announced this theme, this topic that we're on of transformation, of encountering God, and that this truth that Jesus is bringing hope and healing and wholeness, and that we're part of that. And Frank told us the story of Abraham, and he showed us how God interacted with Abraham. And one of the things that I was thinking about when I was thinking about Abraham's story is that the transformation that was happening in Abraham wasn't just for Abraham. Like the whole point of God transforming Abraham and taking him on the journey that he took him on was so that Abraham would be the blessing to the nations, so that really all people would experience what hope and healing and wholeness God had in mind for humanity. And I was thinking, too, about what Josh had shared last week about Isaiah coming into that encounter with God in the temple and realizing his own unworthiness and having the angel take the live coal and place it on his lips. And the message that Isaiah was given, this encounter that Isaiah had with the living God wasn't just for him. It was for a message that was to go out to the people God wanted to reach. And I was thinking then of what Rachel was talking about this morning, and somehow that all fits together. And I was thinking about how Steve started us off this morning, and I was thinking about how Colton led us in these songs of worship, and I'm feeling like this whole thing is connecting, and it feels pretty awesome to be a piece of that story. And so I don't know what kind of pictures you supplied there for the frames, but I want to show you mine. That guy in the purple jumpsuit, I guess that's what you call it. I was going through a Lakers phase, and so I grew up in Oregon, and my family were Blazers people, and it was my little rebellious phase, I guess, as a youngster, trying out something on my own maybe, but that was my Lakers sweatshirt. And that bat, I don't know, it doesn't look like I'm going to really hit anything with that, but that was me as a preteen. Hopefully nobody's recording this and sending it out on the internet. Kind of hard to believe looking at that guy that this is broken beyond repair. But what happened is in the years since that photo was taken, just within a couple of years, I had come to the place in my understanding of God that I had realized that I was a sinner, and that there was actually nothing that I could do to kind of make that right. And I lived in a lot of fear because I was afraid of what would happen to me if I died, and I was afraid of saying yes to God because I thought that would mess up my life. And so I was kind of stuck in that for a while, and it was a kind of hell. It wasn't more than a couple years after this, I think I was 10 or 11, when I asked Jesus to forgive me and to come into my heart. That's kind of the language I would have used in those days, and that was real, and that changed me. That kind of hell that I'd been going through gave way to a kind of peace. And it happened really quickly. Like when I said that, I felt that peace. That fear was actually gone. And it wasn't that fear totally left my life at that point, but that was something that God really did in me, and it changed me. You look forward there a couple years, that guy in the white shirt's got a smile on his face. I was actually laughing, I think, at the photographer, but something was missing. By the time this is my senior picture, by the time I hit the end of high school, I wasn't so sure that the whole Christianity thing was for real. And that was because of how that I had experienced that. I had been trying to be a good Christian all my life, and it just wasn't working for me, and I was really struggling. I was looking around me, and I was seeing that, people say stuff about following Jesus and loving God and all of that, and caring about their neighbors, and how does that even work? I don't see that happening. I didn't see it happening inside of myself. And I came to the end of high school, and I was basically ready to give up on the whole thing. And there's a guy who had given some meetings at my church, and he was going to give a course out at Rosedale Bible Institute. And he was a guy who looked to me like he had something for real. And so I decided to go out there. It was the last time he was going to be delivering his course, and I wanted to see if there was something real, and if I could experience that for myself, maybe then I could carry on as a follower of Jesus. If not, I was basically done with the whole thing. And what happened was I went out to Ohio, not knowing really anyone out there, and a couple who lived across the campus there had invited me to stay in their duplex or apartment or whatever. And it was before the term started. I had gone to the room to go to bed, and unexpectedly encountered God. I guess you could call it was as if God was speaking to me. I don't know that there was an audible voice, but it was that sharp and as real as spoken communication. Something like this: Brian, you've been trying really hard to be a good Christian, but it's not about that. It's about knowing me. And that changed my life. Bible college wouldn't have helped me at all if I hadn't encountered God. And so with that in mind, I carried on through life here, and you can see a picture of me there. Something needs mending. This was taken a few weeks ago when school started. I've been discovering how true it is that life as God intended is about knowing Him. I've been discovering that. Falteringly at times, but I've been discovering that. I've been finding that. So I've moved from fear to failure and finding. And just this week even, I was headed home from the fall what is it, fall festival thing, headed to pick up my kids, and I was alone in the car, and Jesus pointed out something that I had an issue of that was between us and that I needed to resolve. And it had to do with my looking to others for acceptance and my kind of pride and kind of counting on my own ability and knowledge. And so it's not like I'm perfect or anything. It's that I've been discovering how real God's transformation is. Earlier this week, it was on Friday, one of my students in the sophomore class asked me, if you could go back to any point in your life, what would you go back to? And I thought about that question a little bit, and I sat down and I said, I don't want to go back to anywhere. And I actually got emotional about it too. When I think about my relationship with God now, I don't want to go back anywhere. And I think the reason for that is because it's real, but also because what has shaped that has been largely painful. It's just been hard things to go through. And I wouldn't want to go back anywhere. Well, that's kind of my story. I'm intrigued by Jesus, and the title was Jesus and Transformation. And I just want to say that Jesus has been transforming me in loads of ways. And if you would have known me, that kid with the bat, if you would have known me, you would see the transformation that's happened to me. And if you had known me in that picture in the middle, you would see that I'm a different sort of person than I was then. And if you were, like Carla, married to me, you would see that I'm not the same person I was 2 years ago or 5 years ago, or when I started hanging out in Iowa. I'm a different person, and anything good out of that is actually because Jesus has been transforming me. So that's what I wanted to say about that. So Jesus intrigues me. His way of telling stories is a bit like, the porcupine, and I'll talk about that here in just a minute. But he tells these random stories as he's interacting with people. And he's doing it largely in a context where things are awkward and there's conflict and the stakes are high. And those are exactly the kinds of conversations that I would rather avoid. But Jesus has this really intriguing way of accepting the challenge and telling stories that mess people up. So maybe you know this story. There's the man who misplaced something that really mattered. Maybe you've heard that one before. Or maybe you've heard the one he told about the woman who couldn't find the thing that she needed. I was thinking about actually a particular license that was needed for driver's ed. And I didn't ask my son if I could tell this story, so I'll probably pay for that. But I remember the angst and urgency to find the license before driver's ed started. And maybe you can think of things that you've lost and misplaced and couldn't find, and think about the urgency of that. And Jesus tells this story about two sons who couldn't stand their dad. And he tells a story about a manager whose accounting practices got him fired. And the politician and the pastor who walked into a church. I was going to say the Republican and the Democrat who walked into the church and who came out justified. It's not the one you think. So we're looking in Luke, and I would like to center our story on what the ones that are happening in Luke 15. But really what's happening in Luke is that we have from the at the end of chapter 13, Jesus has been expressing his concern over Jerusalem, which is kind of a way of talking about the whole set of people who are Jewish, right? All of his people. And he's expressing his desire for them to come to him. And then he's actually kind of traveling. He's way to Jerusalem, and we all know what he's going to, right? He's going to go to his death. And as we get to the end in Luke 19 of this segment, this journey to Jerusalem, Jesus, the line is that he came to seek and to save the lost. And then we have him again in the triumphal entry, kind of like longing for his people to come to God. And so what we're hearing in the stories that are listed out here are actually kind of in that context. And here for chapter 15, the immediate context, if you look at the first couple of lines, is that tax collectors and sinners were drawn to Jesus. They were drawing near to Jesus. They were hanging out with him. He was eating with them. And this was causing some problems. And the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbled. And I was working with two different translations here. I think maybe the word in the NIV is muttered. And so Jesus tells this story about the shepherd. And so I want to ask you if you know how many Pharisees are shepherds. How many Pharisees are shepherds? Anybody know the answer? None of them are. You see, shepherds are a great thing in theory. But the problem with shepherds is they've got animals that'll get on your property and eat your crops and go on their way, and you can never recover that. And so a shepherd can never pay for that sin and never know who to pay. Can't do anything about it. And so Pharisees would maybe honor shepherds, the great shepherds of the past and so on. But for all practical purposes, shepherds are inexcusable people. They could never pay for their sins. And the Pharisees, we sometimes give them a hard rap for that. But the reason they cared about that is they wanted God's kingdom. You know what the Pharisees wanted? They wanted God's kingdom to come, and the way that was going to happen is if we could just get everybody to be good, God's kingdom will come. And wouldn't that be awesome? And so that's why they were grumpy about stuff that didn't add up and that wasn't set right. It's because they wanted God's kingdom to come, and they knew for that to happen, everybody had to be good. Well, anyway, notice what Jesus does with his story here, and that's why the porcupine's up here. When I was reading these stories again this week, I was realizing that Jesus' stories are not just kind of ordinary, everyday stuff so that everybody can understand. These are barbed stories. I read on the internet about a guy who took a porcupine quill to the bicep. And instead of going to the doctor, he just let it pass through. And it took a couple of days, but the thing just worked its way through. I don't know if it's true. It was on the internet. But so they showed me a picture, too, of what a quill looks like really close up. And what it is, it looks like scales on the quill. It looks like there are scales on it, and what those scales are actually are barbs. So I used to think like like a fish hook has a barb and all of that, but actually the whole quill is barb. And if you try to pull the thing backwards, those barbs kind of like span out, and so you rip stuff out if you try to back a quill out. Jesus' stories are like this. And so let's see how he does this. He tells a story to people who think shepherds are bad people, and he says, which of you, do you see that? Which of you? He puts the Pharisees in the shepherd place. Well, which of you, if you've got a flock of 100 sheep and you're out in the wilderness letting them eat their way through other people's property, which of you, having lost one of your flock, wouldn't go and search for it until you found it? And wouldn't you pick that sheep up, which apparently sheep can't return on their own, they have to be picked up and moved? which of you wouldn't just go ahead and shoulder that thing and bring it back to town? And when you got there, wouldn't you be excited that you had recovered what was lost? And so Jesus tells this story, and the barb is sinking in. And Jesus says another story. He says, which of you, or think about it this way. A woman loses a coin in a house. Now, just a quick question. How many Pharisees are women? They're not. I don't know. They're all guys. Now, I think Pharisees can have families and all of that, but the women, I guess, don't count. And Jesus tells this second barbed story, and it says, suppose a woman has 10 coins and loses one. And doesn't she light the lamp and sweep the house and find that thing? And when she does, won't she call her neighbors and get excited and, phone them up and say, I found my silver coin. It was 1/10 of all I owned, and here it is. I found it again. And wouldn't that be like what God thinks when one sinner repents? Or when that shepherd returns with the flock? No, when the shepherd returns with the one that was lost. Did you ever think about where the rest of the 99 are? Do you think that they might still be out in the open country? And maybe they haven't heard about the celebration that's going on for the one. And maybe this is ironic. And maybe this is the barb working its way a little bit deeper. Jesus continues. Have you heard about the father who had 2 sons? Well, the younger son came to his father and he poked his finger. It wasn't his index finger, but he poked a finger right in his father's face and he said, give me right now the money that will be distributed to me on your death. In other words, I wish you were dead. Now it's important to realize here that the father in this story is not an American father. He's a Middle Eastern father. And I'd like you to use your cultural imagination to think about how that would go for a Middle Eastern father. Everybody knows how that should go. What should the father do? He probably needs to beat that son, except if the son has done this publicly, what should the father do? Because the father is living in an honor society, this is incredibly dishonoring. The son saying, I wish you were dead and give me the estate, unheard of. This would never happen. And if this was done publicly, everybody knows what should happen to the son. That son is going to lose his life. And so this story goes on. It's an outrageous story. So the father actually divides the inheritance. And so the younger son stands to inherit 1/3 of the estate. The older son will get 2/3 of the estate. The younger son will get 1/3. And so as the son collects his assets, he actually leaves town. Probably the community would think of him as a pretty dastardly son anyway. It's probably a good thing that he's leaving. Probably he can't stay in the community anyway. But he takes the money and he goes and spends it. He spends it all in reckless living and in wild living. I should probably catch up the slides here. Oh, well, maybe I'm not. Anyway, we'll have to think about that stuff too. Anyway, so he squanders his wealth in wild living, and while he's there, as we know, there's a point where famine makes it necessary for the young man to come to his senses, and he does. And he realizes that if he would just go home and work for his dad, he'd be better off than where he is right now, not having any food and having no one who gave him anything. And so what I'd like us to think about is where do we see ourselves in the story? Now, some people, this is the way stories work, which I love because that's my profession, is to tell stories and to think about how stories work. And I love how this works. We identify with a character. And maybe we identify with this son who's kind of offended his father and gone off and he's spent it all. I don't know if you can even see that, but he had some attitudes there and some actions. He says, give me. He creates distance between him and his father. He squanders his wealth. He lives wild. He spends everything. And what is the outcome of that in the story? As Jesus unfolds this story for us, what is the outcome of that kind of living? He begins to be in need. He has this longing, and no one actually gives him anything. Now, when you think about the snapshots on your camera roll, do you see anything that parallels this story in the snapshots that you have on your mental camera roll? Let's think about this from the son's point of view. From the son's point of view, what's the underlying problem here? What's the solution? He's come to his senses, and he comes to the realization that he's sinned. He's actually unworthy to be called a son. And he thinks the solution is work. I can go work for Dad. That's a pretty audacious idea given his circumstances, but he makes the plan and he sets off for home. He plans out his speech. He plans out what he'll say. He says, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. And so he got up and went to his father. Anybody connect with this? You can see this happening around you, maybe happening in you, or has happened in you. So we want to pay attention now to what the Father does. And my students love when I do this. They think it's funny. You don't have to laugh at all. Sober faces, scholar faces, everyone. There's a big but here. There's actually two big buts. While he was still a long way off, his father saw him. He sees him. He fills with compassion. He runs to him, and he kissed him. And you may have heard, I think there's some cultural things going on here. A little weird for guys to kiss. Anyway, kissing him is actually important. He was kissing him a lot. And running toward him culturally is even more outrageous. Because you've maybe seen these Middle Eastern patriarchs. They do not wear jeans or joggers. Right? They have robes. And if that father is going to run, he's going to humiliate himself by pulling that thing up and running out to meet his son. It's outrageous. Never happens. And the barb of the story is working itself a little bit deeper. The son begins his speech. Father, I have sinned against heaven. This is probably between kisses, I'm thinking. Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. And the father interrupts him. But the father said to his servants, like he pauses kissing him and says, servants, quick, robe, ring, sandals. Why is the father calling for these things? Because it's his son. And he's still his son, and he was lost, and now he's found. And this is cause for celebration. So not only does the son get the robe, whose robe is that? That's the father's robe. Whose ring is that? That's the father's ring. It gives him the authority in the household. What are those sandals for? Well, that's to let the servants know who's in charge. And the sons come home. And the father says, son. And he makes him son. And he says, servants, go, get that cattle there and slaughter it. We're having a party. Let's get that party started right now. And I'm hearing echoes of some other stories that Jesus told. And maybe you are too. And they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, you'd almost forget this story was about two sons. But here's the barb digging deeper. The older son was in the field. He came near the house and he hears the music. And once again, let's pay attention. What do we see? Okay, here's what we saw about that. Okay, yes, we saw that. Okay, what do we see about ourselves, or what do we see about people in this? Here's the guy who's working, the brother who's working. He comes near. He finds out what's going on. He gets angry, and he refuses to go in. Now, just think about this for a second. The father hasn't changed at all, has he? The same father in the story, right? Just a different character, different son. Let me ask you this. Does the son staying outside the party mean anything in a Middle Eastern context? I think it probably does. What would it signify? It means that the son is shaming the father. He's refusing to go to his dad's party. And the father has to come out with him and plead with him to come in. And he's doing this in a very public way. And what should happen to the older son? The son who does something this dishonoring to his father. You might have some ideas about that. But what are the outcomes of the attitudes and the actions of the older son? So what are the outcomes? What does he feel? Emotionally, he feels like he's a slave to his father. He has never disobeyed his father, and he wants his father to make sure that he knows that. Never disobeyed you. And you never gave me anything. But actually, when that younger son asked for his share of the inheritance, to whom did the father give the inheritance? Look, you can look back if you want to. It's right at the beginning of the story. It says the father divided his inheritance between them. Between them. The older son has his inheritance too. And even though his father is still living, it's his. Look at what the father says to him. Look, for all these years, a slave for you, I've never disobeyed your orders. But you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fatted calf for him. Do you understand why the older son is so angry? Raise your hand if you're wondering why the older son is so angry. Or do you understand? I think one of the reasons the older son is so angry is because that kid who went and wasted 1/3 of the estate has come home. And what's going to happen to my share now if he's a son again? So this typically happens in families after the wealthy father dies, right? You have to divide up the inheritance. And probably you've heard some stories about anger and fractured relationships because of these things. Right? We actually understand this pretty well, I think. Anyway, look at what the father says. You are always with me. Everything I have is yours. we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive, and he was lost and is found. Can you guys read that? Oh, that's too far. The outcome. One of the crazy things, and this is the barb kind of working its way down to the bone now, is this story is unfinished. Jesus leaves this story hanging in the air. Structurally, this story is missing something. The ending. What will the older brother do about this party throwing? You see, Jesus has been hanging out with people that the Pharisees knew weren't good, and he's been treating them like they belong in the great feast. And the Pharisees realize that God's kingdom can never come unless everybody's good. And it puts them in conflict with Jesus. Well, so to recap, we've gone through the stories. You've heard me say that they're barbs, and I think the barb is for really any listener. Who do you identify with in the story? Do you identify with the one who goes and spends it all on wild living? Do you identify with the guy who stays at home and never causes any problems, always responsible, and still he's distant from his father even though he's a son? You see, that's the issue, isn't it? I think, when I think back to those pictures, I think between the guy with the bat and the guy who was smiling in that picture, I didn't understand that God wanted my heart and he wanted to know me. He actually wanted to spend time with me. Like, he actually wanted me to want him. And I actually didn't want him. I wanted my get out of hell free ticket. And if you read these passages in Luke and these stories and the things that Jesus is saying, you can see God's heart bleeding for people through what Jesus is saying and doing as he goes to the cross, and he actually deals with all of the sin stuff. And you realize that what he's doing, even though that's still to come, is he's saying this kingdom of God that you're looking for is right here. It's right now. There will be one who shoulders the responsibility. He's actually doing that. There will be one who seeks diligently. It's what Jesus is doing. There is a party. It's a celebration. And the people who are invited may not want to come. So we're going to go and get whoever wants to come to this party. When you think about the pictures, the snapshots, the things from your own life, the things that you see in your community where things are broken beyond repair and in need of mending, this is where God's kingdom is coming. And this is what Jesus is doing, joining this movement of saying, Lord, send workers into your harvest, is happening right here among us. And we are in this story. So I was thinking then about how transformation happens and how do we experience transformation. I think one of the things that it takes is for us to see something could be different. This offers us hope. We see a compelling vision. We see a father restoring a son, and we say there's something beautifully awesome about that, and I want that. But until we want it enough to go home, and we can get past, I'm going to work for you, and realize that we're actually the son, the daughter, we still have this incredible distance. Even though the opportunity is right in front of us. And this is why Jesus' stories work like barbs, because they say you've got to decide what it is you want. And what I've discovered in my life, and maybe you can see this in your life too, is that I tend to change only when the pain becomes too great to stay the same. If you identify with the older brother, what are you going to do about that? If you identify with the younger brother, the one who comes home and says, I'm going to work, I think that's where I was between the bat and the white shirt in my pictures. And I've been discovering that God's grace is gift. It's about a relationship. And I honestly have not always wanted God in my life. But when we discover the truth about that, we can find our real identity. This is cause for celebration, and that's why we even get together. Look, the guys, the Republican and Democrat who went to church, and the one who went away justified, like, this is us. Why'd you come here? Is it because doing church is the thing to do? Or did you want to actually, be with God and celebrate with his family? You know? This is who we are. Well, anyway, that's enough of that. I think that what's happened in me is that I've been understanding, bit by bit, more and more, the Father's heart. And it's actually been changing me. It really has. I look at somebody, and I don't think, homeless dude. I think, he's got a story, and God really cares about him. And when I see that burqa or whatever, I don't think, what's she doing here? I think the Father's heart is for her. You know what? She's a daughter too. She is meant for life with God, as we all are. So, I don't know. I think it would be awesome if we could tell each other stories about how Jesus is actually transforming us. And I think probably the person to share your stories with is whoever will listen. So let's do that. All right. God, as we think about the snapshots of our own lives and our own communities, we do know that there's lots that's broken. Some of it seems really hopeless. When we think about relationships that are fractured and where fathers and sons are estranged, and where mothers and daughters don't talk to each other, we know that there's so much broken, and we know that your kingdom is about putting things right. And we're realizing, God, from these stories is that we don't have to have it right in order to get in on that. We just have to come. And maybe we even have to come to the end of our ropes before we can see it. But as we see the ruin around us, would you grow your heart in us so that we would resemble you in the way we do, that we would throw parties, that each day, more and more, we'd become like you. Amen.